Hello and welcome to the Econ Buck podcast. I'm your host, Lee Stitzel. With me today is Dr. Ryan Mattson, Assistant Professor of Economics at West Texas A&M University. Ryan, welcome.
Thanks, Lee. It's great to be here.
So, Ryan, our topic today is the monetary policy response to the coronavirus, or COVID-19 as it's known. So I want to start off with the question on everybody's mind, at least those of us who think about economic things. What is the potential economic consequences of social distancing, workplaces shutting down, and larger events and gatherings being canceled?
So from a macroeconomic standpoint, what is going to happen, of course, is, and as people have seen happen, we're going to see a contraction in the GDP numbers when that comes out. A contraction or slowing down. We've seen an increase in the unemployment numbers. We've already seen a large increase in the unemployment claims that have come out. But basically, people stop going to restaurants. Restaurants have to lay off workers. People stop going to the bank. The bank doesn't necessarily need those workers, so they put them on furlough or they have them work from home. We start to see this slowdown in economic activity. And I think what people need to remember is that consumption is the largest driver of economic growth in the U.S. So to have 330 million people cut their consumption is a rather large hit to the growth in our economy, the growth in our production, because someone's spending is always someone else's income. So that's the main thing that we'll see with workplaces shutting down. We'll see people being laid off, people becoming unemployed, hopefully for a short period of time. And then we should see, at least we're hoping as macroeconomists, to see a bounce back in GDP once the public health crisis is resolved or at least assuaged, once we've flattened the curve.
So I'm glad you went directly to that. I think economists agree, at least all the ones that I've been reading and listening to and following, that we're going to see a dip out of this. I mean, there's no way that you can't, like you described,
Right.
just sort of literally, physically less economic activity happening that's gonna translate directly to a GDP dip. Now, as far as I've observed, it's very split on whether economists think that this is just a momentary blip and that when things come back, depending on when they come back, obviously, but when things come back, that it'll come back pretty strong. Russ Roberts is in that camp. That he basically thinks we'll just pick up where we left off, more or less. That the dip would be pretty small. And then others, including like John Cochran at Chicago or Tyler Cowen, would think that the GDP dip is liable to be quite large. If I can weigh in very briefly before you, I think economics is the story of coordination, and it's the story of mutually beneficial exchange that's happening. And when those go away, it's hard work to put those connections back together. And some things, when the business is going to be there and the important or difficult parts of that industry are like large capital things, like I would point to airlines, there's a good chance that if we don't lose all the airlines, that even if we were to have one airline go into bankruptcy, we're not going to lose that industry, and the amount of economic activity is going to happen there. But if you were to have the loss of like a local restaurant, say, I think we've all observed that one building that restaurants repeatedly try to start up and it just never takes off.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because establishing that connection with your suppliers and your probably mostly your customers, your suppliers, your customers, your employees is really hard. And it takes time to build a reputation around a restaurant. And so, we're here in Amarillo, Texas, and one of my favorite local restaurants is a restaurant called Blue Sky. If those guys go out of business and somebody just jumps up in that building, I might give them a try. But they're very likely to never have that level of loyalty.
We're all praying that Blue Sky sticks around.
Yeah,
we all love Blue Sky.
Yes,
Yeah.
we're praying to the macroeconomic gods that they don't take our Blue Sky burgers.
Great
away
sandbox for the kids too.
Yeah, exactly right. And so, weigh in on that. Where do you come down between, or maybe you're even more optimistic than Roberts or more pessimistic than Cochran, but weigh in on that for us.
But it's hard to get more pessimistic than Cochran. I certainly love his blog, The Grumpy Economist. He's definitely it's not completely doom and gloom, but he has. I fall more into his camp in terms of this is going to have a more long run implication. I think that we differ on where that comes from. So my general opinion on this, on the recession that's coming at the same time as this coronavirus, is that we were already on our way to a contraction. We had already seen some of the macroeconomic indicators like industrial production was contracting in the month of December of last year, before we had even gotten word from the Chinese government on the 31st. At least that's what my timeline's saying. I could be wrong on that. But late December, when we began seeing some of the first cases of COVID-19 pop up, we were already slowing down. The yield spread, which is one of the most famous predictors of recessions, inverted in Q2 of 2019. So the bond markets were already feeling like there was some softness or volatility in the market, to the point where with what happens with the yield spread is basically a 3-month treasury bond starts paying off more than a 10-year treasury bond. So you have this weird inversion of how store of value is supposed to behave. So what I've been seeing Q4 19 into Q1 2020 is that we had this recession on the way, and then a financial crisis triggered by the global pandemic. And then you have the equity markets respond with something to the effect of $3 to $4 trillion worth of value in stocks suddenly go away within the space of a couple of weeks, where people are beginning to run on equities. People draw their money out of it. Demand falls for equities. People are pushing out of store of value or speculation and into a secure medium of exchange like cash, checking deposits, gold, I suppose. Anything that they feel would be a better medium of exchange at the end of the world. And then you have the quarantine effects going on, the social distancing. So you have this perfect storm of economic activity contraction going on at the same time. So from what I would say is that not only are we going to have this issue that you're talking about with the supply chain, and that Cochrane I think also addressed in his post, with people setting back up their supply chains, people getting their loans going back. And this is what the Federal Reserve has been doing with dropping interest rates to zero, making sure people can have loans. But I think consumers are going to change their pattern of behavior based on this. I think that this is a sufficiently traumatic event for retail services to witness a very deep shift. So I was driving back from the Grand Canyon in early March, just before the real large announcements of social distancing came in, and we stopped in McDonald's in Albuquerque, and we figured, okay, we'll go through the drive-through. We were trying to beat a storm at the same time, and as I walk into the McDonald's, I notice a sign that says, "Takeout only, drive-through only. Please don't sit in the area." They had the seats up and everything. And they had even, at that point, locked the bathroom doors. So I couldn't go in, use the restroom, and continue. No, we had to go back and go through the drive-through and make sure that we did that. Of course, you had the poor people working there with gloves and masks on and distributing the food. What I see from this is I figure if I'm going to be managing McDonald's and we have, say, 18 months of a pandemic while we wait for a vaccination to come out, those computerized ordering systems are going to start looking really good to me. And also as a consumer, I might go in and figure, well, do I want to be handing this dollar bill, which Lord knows how many people have touched that, with this change? Wouldn't it be much more sanitary for me to use my credit card? And wouldn't it be much more sanitary for me to touch a screen and send in an electronic order that's then brought out? You've minimized at least two other people handling the money and the food. And I think that consumers are going to start demanding more and more of that. That's going to mean that places like McDonald's, which employ a lot of people, aren't going to need so many workers. You have self-checkouts at Walmart, self-checkouts at the grocery store. I think that this is going to shift a lot of people's preferences to using those kinds of monetary interactions, those kinds of transactions. So I think that coming out of it, not just from a supply side, everyone's talking about the supply side of this crisis, and that is a huge deal. But I think the demand side is going to be the largest driver of what's going to happen. And I think that, when we get out of this, whether that is if it's in 3 months, then I'd say I'm wrong and we can all go back to normal. But if we start pushing 6, 12, 18, 24 months of this, which who knows? I think consumers will begin to change their behavior. And since we have, this is a perfect time for the sort of Schumpeterian creative destruction to go through the market. And I think there's going to be a lot of churn in terms of people are going to get laid off, and then their job may or may not exist anymore in a year. There may be other jobs existing, but you may not have as many food industry retail, and then those people will need time to retrain to find another job. And I haven't looked at college enrollments, but I'm betting on, since all of these social distancing endeavors are going on, I'm betting that not a lot of people are going back and getting their BAs or MBAs either. So I think that there's going to be a significant lag in the recovery from this recession. So that's where I fall, and I'm definitely more pessimistic than Roberts. Maybe slightly more optimistic than Cochrane. I don't know.
Yeah, you sound pretty close to Cochrane there. So you said a whole bunch of things, and I really want to pull several of those threads. So the first thing that I'd like to just maybe almost as an aside, because neither of us are experts on this, I think even 12 to 18 months on a vaccine is probably extremely optimistic. That's if things go right. That's if we sort of maintain this level of interest in having a vaccine, because I'm given to understand that this is something that is likely to have a season for a while. That this is something that's we're going to deal with it in 2020 and then be done with it.
I've been looking at the 1918 Spanish flu as the model. That's what I'm trying to go off of in terms of how I think the economy is going to react.
Yeah, and of course, I'm talking specifically about a vaccine. I think those are hard to make them both effective and safe at the same time. That's based on some of the readings that I've had. And I'm not talking about sort of the somewhat eccentric crowd out there that thinks vaccines are dangerous, and that's not my point. So let me make that very quickly. I do think vaccines are safe and effective, but they're that way because the scientists that engaged in them intentionally work towards making them that way, and that takes time.
That takes a lot of time and effort. Yes,
I want in a year to 18 months. You can come back to me and tell me that I was wrong, because I think that's extremely optimistic. That's not science. That's not a kind of science that you just pull out of your hat. And maybe it will, because there's a big incentive to get this done and get it done right and get it done quickly. So unless you wanted to comment on that, I'll go ahead and move forward.
No, I agree completely. The response to this is going to take time. The whole idea of shelter at home and the quarantining and flattening the curve, these are not things that happen overnight. This is something that needs to be on a consistent basis, and that, of course, you have to couple that with the vaccine. And then you've got to get we keep reading about hospital equipment that needs to be brought in case certain cases get worse. All of those things take time, they take effort, and they take money.
And I think the importance of the vaccine depends on how well the curve is flattened. So if the curve is flattened and there's lots of us that don't get it and are potentially still susceptible to it, then the vaccine becomes very, very important, because then otherwise it'd be very easy to flare right back up next season. If the extreme end of the potential numbers get out there, and then I've seen estimates as high as 70% of Americans will get it or something. I mean, that
Mhm.
that begins to function as its own vaccine, right? Like the vaccine imitates you getting it, allowing you to get the antibodies.
Yeah,
So if you and I were to get it, then we're not as worried about a vaccine. Of course, obviously, again, we're not experts on this, so we're just kind of talking in
sure,
broad
sure.
strokes here. But barring mutations and the different kind of
Well,
strains
and
that might develop.
this I think must be where it's frustrating to be the Federal Reserve right now, because what the Federal Reserve can do in terms of this recession is just make liquidity available, which is what they've done. And honestly, we're probably not going to see the effects of that for, I would say, even at least a month. Because in order for the Federal Reserve's tools to work, you have to have people who want loans. You have to have people who want to engage in economic activity. So driving the interest rates down to zero isn't going to matter if no one wants to take out a loan and, I don't know, expand their McDonald's franchise or hire a new professor or build an oil refinery. So a lot of this liquidity, these trillions of dollars that the Fed is pumping into the system, could sit on the sidelines in the same way that it did in the 2008 to 2009 and into 2010 recession, where that the main story from that, I think, was when we did quantitative easing, you have this $2.5 trillion quantitative easing program going in over several years, and then you have banks sitting on that money and increasing their excess reserves to these $1 trillion amounts, which haven't been seen at least in the history of our country. You had the problem of people not wanting to lend to people who are demanding loans. And I think also coupled with the fact that, in 08, 09, everybody was losing their jobs. So no one's taking out loans when they're laying out or when they're laying off workers or they're losing their jobs. I think we're going to see the same thing here, that liquidity that they're pumping through, the actions that the Federal Reserve is taking, that's not really going to have the desired effect that we want until things start coming back, which it's great that it's there. When this public health crisis is resolved and businesses want to expand and hire again, then it will be very easy for them to do so. But as in terms of the month of March, and I think even into the month of April, there's not going to be much demand for that.
So I want to ask one quick question before I kind of tie those two things that we've just covered together. With the excess reserves that have gone up, and we know those went up dramatically following the quantitative easing in 2008, 2009 and forward, has that come down? Are banks back down to low levels? Or is there still that sort of excess in the
So, in terms of, and sorry if you hear some clicking here, I'm trying to pull up my graphs. In terms of excess reserves, we had been coming down. 2018, 2019. So you have these banks building up an excess reserves, are basically reserves that banks hold above their requirements from the Fed. Like a bank's supposed to hold back, I don't know, 10% because they want to avoid a run on the bank and the bank collapsing. Well, now banks are holding back much higher of their own accord. They just don't want to lend out. So we hit kind of this large 2.3 trillion excess reserve number around 2011 or 2012, and that really didn't start coming down until the past couple of years. So we were on our way towards bringing that down. The question, I guess, and so far as I can tell now, the data is not really in yet, but my guess is that the banks are going to be holding back more. One, because they probably don't want to lend all that much right now, and two, because I just don't see why people would want to borrow all that much right now.
So let me jump in there because one of the things whenever I asked you the GDP dip question, and then you followed up with asking if we could have seen this coming. And I think you made an important point that bears repeating, which is we were likely headed to recession anyways.
Yes.
And now we've abutted these two things against each other, the pandemic and what would have been probably we were headed for a recession anyways. What would have been a recession, and you postulated that that's going to cause this to be um, deeper and longer recession than we might
Mhm.
otherwise have experienced. And then you went on to say, well, this could have long term impact on the way that we structure the economy, right? We'd be more risk averse when it comes to
Mhm.
um, to germs and passing the virus about, and that we might get used to the way that we're living. And that depends largely on how long we stay in this social distancing, quarantine, self isolation, all the different stages and steps that we could potentially be in. I think yesterday the president announced that we were expecting social distancing to last at least through April 30th. So we have another month of this to go.
Mhm.
And whether that ends up being just another month and then we go about enjoying our summer, or whether that ends up being all the way through summer, or it ends up being 6 months, 18, 24 months, I sort of hopefully doubt that this would be 2 straight years of this, but we don't know.
Mhm.
Um, I guess maybe I'm a bit more optimistic than you are on that front, but I want to kind of make a point and then get your reaction to it. And so the way that I see it is this: if we end up with something relatively short, even 3 months, say it runs to the end of May or something like that, then I can see everybody coming out and okay, we've sort of been isolating, we've changed our lives. For some of us, that's a small change. For some of us, that's a huge change. For you and me right now, we're recording this remotely, despite both of us living in the same city and working at the same institution. You've been a guest on the podcast several times now. We've always recorded in person.
Yep.
So I enjoy, I'd say maybe the best feature of my job is the ability to talk to people like you in the hallway every day and, go get our coffees and share lunch together and sit and talk and share ideas and bounce economics around. That's how this podcast got started, after all. And so I'm unhappy to not have you in studio today, and yet we're having this kind of connection. And so
Mhm.
it sort of cuts both ways in my opinion, where on one hand I'll be very happy when this runs its course and hopefully for the fall semester we're back together in person, and so I think people do want that human connection. I
Mhm.
think it's maybe played up a little bit how much we live our lives electronically. I certainly do, right? I'm attached to my phone, you're probably attached to yours, and yet I I would rather be I would rather be sitting here in person having this conversation. So on one hand, I'll see people, especially if this is really short run, I can see people wanting to get back to that personal interaction. And that would include even things like you mentioned directly, which is I want to go sit in a restaurant and enjoy that atmosphere and have people
Sure. Absolutely.
around as I'm enjoying a meal. I want to sit with my family and friends in that setting. Um, and
You
so
want
I
to
can
spend
see
that stimulus.
that. Say that again.
You want to spend that stimulus.
Yeah,
Your
exactly.
expenditure is someone's income. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And yet, on the other hand, this is a point that you made somewhat indirectly, and I want to make it very explicit for our listeners, is there is a learning curve to certain things, right? And so, you and I are fortunate to work at a university that is absolutely 100% on top of its online education game. Both of us teach online remotely, um, and we have spent a lot of time working on it ourselves, talking to each other, talking to our other colleagues, figuring out how to go through and deliver and teach in an online environment. I think most of us would agree that's probably not a full and perfect substitute for in class. There are things that you get from being there in person that are really important. And yet, you and I know, because over the course of the past few years, we've gone and adopted okay, how do I go and teach and interact in an online only environment? And so we learned with some of those tools. And now the rest of the world is being forced to learn okay,
Mhm.
how do I go about recording a podcast if I can't be in person? Well, okay, this software, that software, we need this kind of hardware, and so on. And so there will be a natural consequence of that, which is people will be more accustomed to living in an online environment. And so I see people postulate that maybe we'll see a lot fewer meetings happen in person. And if I need to have a 9 o'clock meeting, maybe the 9 o'clock meeting can just be done remotely. And so we could see some big changes on that. So I see several different factors at play there. One is I think you could be right, and this maybe wouldn't have been one of my arguments before sitting down and having this conversation with you. I could see people being more risk averse
Mm-hmm.
and therefore wanting to add layers of separation between them
Sure.
and people that they're interacting with if it doesn't feel okay. I do think people will have a desire to be in person and together, and maybe not with everyone always all the time, but I think there will be a desire for that, and I could sort of see that either way. Maybe we go 3 months, and then we really want to get out and about and do things this summer. I've had comments from friends that say, "Oh, when I get out of here, I'm never going to say no to people inviting me out." My guess is we'll flip back to our normal habits very quickly, so that's probably not true. But also, now we'll all be well. This probably you should buy stock in Zoom, right? And
Yeah.
and now everybody knows how to use that. I have a colleague that I'm working on a paper with, and so we agreed to meet via Zoom. And this is a person that's in another state that I'm working with, and I don't normally meet with this colleague at all. We completely communicate via email, and we pass the paper back and forth using Dropbox and whatnot. And now all of a sudden they're like, "Hey, let's have a Zoom meeting." Well, there's nothing about our relationships that's changed by this. I have my computer, they have theirs, and yet now we're able to sort of add an element to that. So there's some changes there. So react briefly there to what I said. I know I covered a lot of ground, so let me summarize really quickly, which is to say that I do think the demand side.
I really like what you're getting at with this point of, you and I are usually in the office together. Hey, we see each other in the hall. Hey, Lee, I had this idea. Let's go talk about this. And we'll go get lunch, we'll go get coffee. And in that act, we are spending a certain amount of money to do that interaction, which you and I did not do for this podcast. We've been going back and forth through email of what we think this podcast should be. So we've lost, and that's kind of a tiny example of, say, this indirect spending and income that is lost through these kinds of social distancing requirements, which are necessary. I just want to point out the cost to it. Now let's take that up a bit, because you and I also are the faculty sponsors for the Economics Club, and 2 Wednesdays out of the month, you and I will order pizza for 20 people, right? 20 faculty and students ish, somewhere between 15 and 20, and so now that's something that's now fully online as well, and we're not spending any money for food anymore on that. And then let's expand it out further. We had to cancel the Dallas Fed Econ Scholars Program, which we had 5 of our students, and you and I were potentially going to go on that. So that's 7 plane tickets to Dallas, 7 people to be put up in a hotel room in Dallas, 7 people to be fed over a 2-day trip while students are engaging in learning. And yes, we can certainly go and do a Zoom meeting with the Dallas Fed economists and the other students that were out there, but we're not spending that money to do it. And that, hey, that's great for, I guess that's great for our travel and research budget, but that's not so great for the macroeconomy if we start stepping back further and further. We also, if we can go even further with this, Texas has a very large shipping industry. And the backbone of that shipping industry are truck drivers who will need to go back and forth between Dallas, Austin, Houston, El Paso, Amarillo. We have the technology to simply say, well, and I'm not saying we get rid of that they're going to get rid of all the truck drivers, but maybe what we're going to do is we're going to attach 3 or 4 driverless trucks to 1 truck driver, who will then bring that. That's one of these kind of innovations that I've seen coming out in terms of driverless cars. Okay, so instead of having one driver, one truck. You could have a fleet of trucks with one driver. And again, that's great for the bottom line of that one truck driver, not so great for the 3 or 4 who are being laid off. And they also make stops. They eat lunches, they eat dinners, they stay in hotels. This is all of that economic activity that is now coming to a halt, or slowing down greatly. And if we come out of this 18 months from now and you have a truck driving firm realizing, well, we used to hire 25 drivers, but you know what? Really all we need are 5. Then you have 20 people who need to find some way to re-enter the economy, re-enter the market. And the jobs they had, it's not that they weren't good truck drivers, it's not that they weren't good people, but their job just doesn't exist. It may be, for you and I, we may come out the other end of this. And so I've been teaching maybe one in-class course each semester. We may come out of this thinking, well, why even one in-class course? And on top of that, okay, so let's say I have 48 people, my principal's macro in class for the fall. Those 48 students would be eating lunch before they go to my class. They would be driving to campus. They would be doing all of this economic activity that contributes to the city of Canyon, to West Texas A&M, and to the U.S. economy in general. We put them all online, and they can very much sit in their pajamas and maybe even 2 in the afternoon, and they get that transaction. They get that benefit of still being in my class and that learning, but there's a host of economic activity that's just no longer associated with it. Now, again, we have creative destruction. There's going to be stuff that comes in to replace that. We've always had these technological shifts that both destroy jobs and create jobs. And, for the past few hundred years, they've ended up creating more than they've been destroying. But there is still a transition period in each of those. You don't need somebody to make a horse or a carriage for a horse anymore because you have cars. In fact, you don't even need someone to raise all of those horses. In fact, now you don't really see that many horses out on the road anyway. All of these things are the product of a long churn of technological change, and one of the silver linings in recessions is that it speeds up those transitions. You had the movement of the U.S. out of an agriculture producer into more of a manufacturing producer, and that transition was sped up by the Great Depression, by people losing their farms, losing their jobs, and then deciding, I need to go work in a factory so I can put food on the table. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, yes, we're getting this technology now to move more towards the service sector, and we begin to have, through a series of recessions, those transitions. I think that COVID-19 will end. That's going to happen. I think the effects of COVID-19 are not going to be what I've heard some economists call the beautiful V-shaped recession. I don't think we're coming out of this with the same growth rate. I think we're going to come out of this with a slower growth rate and with a structure within our economy that is different.
So that's quite a prediction, because the last recovery is the longest, slowest one we've had, if I remember right, from the last time you mentioned
Yes.
Dallas Economic Scholars Program. I'd say the best thing that I took away from that was one of the presentations by the senior economist there, who was pointing out the length and the flatness, if you will, of that recovery. You've mentioned, first of all, what you said there was very powerful and very beautiful, and I do this podcast to try to bring these kind of ideas to people, and I think we have this reflexive, recession bad, kind of response to things, and we forget that recessions can be necessary. Recessions can be something that says our current way that things are structured needs to change. Now, you framed that very well in the context of creative destruction, which is a powerful idea in economics that few people, I think, outside of the field understand and think about. I think they have this broken window fallacy idea about creative destruction. So lay out for us really quickly what creative destruction is. You've kind of been around it. So
Sure.
lay that out for us. But I do want to make sure that you highlight the importance of resource allocation in the context of creative destruction. So just really quickly lay that out for us.
Sure. So in the principles macro, when I talk about this, I try and use, and I'm not sure how contemporary of an example this is anymore, but there was a TV show called Mad Men, which was about people who were in advertising in the 50s and into the 60s. And you had this large pool of women who would do clerical work for the office, type things up, make sure that things are spelled correctly, do the million things that absolutely need to be done with any office work. And you don't see offices like that anymore. That's not something that really exists. What you usually have is 3 or 4 administrators who are highly trained now, and a lot of computers, and I would say a fax machine and a scanner and a printer, but no, those are all now in one machine. So those jobs are gone. They don't exist anymore, and people can't go and apply to be in those jobs anymore. So that's a very historical window of time. And the computers that you and I are working on right now just completely destroyed that market. But at the same time, then what you had these women released from that particular position, and if they were able to get an education to do something else, and then we have the kind of societal change coming of women allowed into the workforce more, allowed into higher level jobs, and we certainly have a huge economic debate and issue with whether or not they're paid the way they should be on this, but they now have access they didn't have in the 50s and 60s to executive level jobs. The creative destruction that came from the technology was part of that churn. Of course, there's societal issues that came through, and people change, and we start to move into different expectations and different preferences. But it freed up the destruction of those jobs, of those secretarial jobs, freed up the ability to work in something else. And that's where this allocation of resources can come in. And there are a lot of different examples with that, but that's the one that at least I try and go to in terms of a contemporary series. I need to find a different TV series because I think now I'm 10 years behind the curve.
But I think that raises a good point, right? Because the creative destruction here is that you have computers and processing softwares that destroyed jobs. But part of what it did is it freed up the resource that was those typically, in this case, those would have been women. It freed them up from being document processors to being people that are much more sophisticated, educated people. My sister-in-law does something that would have been along the lines of this in a law firm now. And her job is very technical, is very high level, right? She's not sitting there entering things into forms, right? No. She's doing something that has to do with organizing and structure and fairly high level thinking. She's well educated, right? And so that's part of what I wanted to highlight. You did a good job highlighting it.
But let me put the caveat here. There's nothing in that to say that is not a painful and long process.
Correct.
That is, and that's another thing I do want to highlight as well. I see the potential for creative destruction to do something that will fundamentally shift how we produce and how we do things. That's not necessarily a happy prediction. I mean, in the long run, it's good, and in terms of as a macro concept, in the long run, this will work out, and we'll be allocating our resources to better things. Lee and Ryan will not waste their time, in the cafeteria downstairs talking about things. Instead, they'll be more efficient with emailing back and forth. But
Okay, I'm gonna push back on that
okay.
actually. Um, and I actually wanted to do this because you said this, you've made this point a couple of times, and I think it's the last point notwithstanding. I think when
Sure.
you were talking earlier about, well, the economy will shift and these different kind of economic activities will go away, and that's almost certain to be true. If we live in a world where you don't come to my office with ideas, if I don't come to your office and say, let's go grab coffee, if you don't say, hey, after this meeting, let's go get lunch, my life is not as good. Like as much as I find our emails, the listeners don't know this, but you and I and another colleague, we send emails around frequently. Hey, here's this article. What do you think? Or, so sometimes that's, really high level stuff that you would expect academics to do. Here's so and so, and they said this, but I think in the context of this other thought, right? We have that, and then sometimes we send each other things that are maybe a little less highbrow, right? And we crack some jokes at what's going on in the public. Those things make my life better, but I'm not entirely sure that it's not as if you and I having that face to face interaction is a negative thing, right? So like in this like weird macro sense that may be like unproductive, but I'm a microeconomist, you're a macroeconomist, so maybe this is the difference in our view. Like that's welfare improving for me, and I hope for you too. And I always tell people one of the best things about my job is that I work with really smart people who think about important things, and we talk and sometimes argue about these. So I would say the world is a better place if people are sitting around having coffee just talking about what interests them. And so, do you have a response to that, or?
Yeah, I was going to make a joke about, well, they always could, write up 3 AIs to replace you, me, and our other colleague to
Yeah.
just write emails back and forth.
Yeah, it wouldn't be that hard because half the time I send you guys
Don't tell
emails
them.
and I send references. So just build a database full of YouTube clips on Simpsons, and then just have an AI that picks out the appropriate one.
Yeah.
And so, I really need to watch The Simpsons because you guys wear me out with those clips. So
yeah, I'm not that contemporary in my examples.
Yeah, Simpsons is really even older than Mad Men there. Something else will replace it, I'm sure, and maybe there will be a ramp up in that because now that we're all home, we need more content to be going through on Netflix, not less, and so the TV companies maybe.
Yeah, oh, that's true.
So let me take a step back here. Because you were talking about this idea, and I think it fits with what I was saying earlier. You said the truck drivers might not have jobs and they may not eat, and you and I don't get to take students to the Dallas Federal Reserve, which is another point, by the way, in terms of we got to be careful thinking about things in terms of only economics, because yeah, absolutely, we don't take our 5 students down to Dallas, and the Dallas economy is somewhat smaller than it might otherwise have been, ignoring crowd out, because we don't take them to we don't stay in the hotel, we don't take them to restaurants and whatnot. But even more important than that is you and I love doing that. We genuinely love economics. That's why we're doing this podcast. That's why you're on this episode and whatnot. And so I think our students are worse off for not having the experience of going to the Dallas Federal Reserve, seeing other students present and do research, seeing the senior economists and other economists there at the Dallas Fed giving presentations and talks, and having the opportunity for, you and I always get to take them to dinner and say, okay, what did you guys like about, what was the best presentation you saw? And they always say stuff, and then we help contextualize, not unlike the podcast has been. You've been on that.
We add value to their human capital.
I think so.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm too arrogant, but I think so.
Yeah.
But I think there's an important point in there when you were talking about all those different things. When I said to kick this off, economics is this story of coordination and mutually beneficial exchange. That's how when we have a contraction, we have a recession, and that stuff goes away, it doesn't happen in a vacuum,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so this is why, like a lot of people who are interested in local development, try to pursue, oh, let's bring this business in. For Amarillo, once upon a time that was like Bell Helicopter, right? Let's bring in Bell Helicopter, and they don't want it just because there's X number of jobs, 250 jobs, whatever it is, 1,000 jobs at Bell Helicopter. It's because if you bring in 1,000 people to work at Bell Helicopter, you need to have the restaurants and you need to have the retail store capacity. You need to have houses. You need to have economic activity begets economic activity. And
Mm-hmm.
what you're telling us today, you haven't said it in so many words, so tell me if you disagree with this, is unfortunately that also works in reverse. And
Yes.
so if we take Bell Helicopter out of here, the restaurants will dwindle and there will be fewer retail stores with less retail capacities. We will need fewer houses. The houses won't go away, so the housing market will experience shrinkage there.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what I mean by saying coordination and mutually beneficial exchange, and that economic activity
Mm-hmm.
causes more economic activity. So I think you did that really well a minute ago, and I just wanted to kind
Yeah.
of hammer on that. Do you want to expand on that?
So, I mean, to just kind of expand on that is to also recognize the importance of the the mechanism by which we have that activity happen. The money that greases the wheels, the money in the plumbing. So, what the Federal Reserve is trying to do right now, to get back to COVID-19, is to just make it really easy for that engine of economic growth to expand when it decides to expand. They are powerless, though, if if demand for those transactions are not there. So kind of going back to these excess reserves, this idea of we have this, and I checked the data now, we've got 1.5 trillion in excess reserves. That's 1.5 trillion dollars worth of transactions that could be happening. That's about, let's see, if GDP is about what, 20 trillion? That's a what, 5% of the economy right there? One out of 20, yeah, 1/20th. That's a rather large number that could be happening. So with well, I guess I shouldn't say oncoming recession anymore. The recession's here. With the recession that we're experiencing now, that was on the horizon last year, with COVID-19 and with the quarantine measures and with the global supply chain also beginning to slow down, there are two effects that are going on here. One, suppliers don't suppliers may not have the desire to supply. They may not have the desire to create things and put it out on the market. And so that slows down the amount of monetary exchange going on there. The larger effect of all of us staying home, as we should, by the way, as we should. I'm not saying go out and spam, stay home, please. But the result of that is that we have this contraction in aggregate demand, this contraction in demand of the entire economy. And it contracts our demand for money. It contracts our demand for actual goods and services. So the Fed's trying to jump in and say, okay, when we're ready to grow, the money is here. And with what I guess would be a typical recession, going back to the Great Depression and the Great Recession, you kind of have more of this contraction of monetary availability. Of maybe this demand is out there, but we don't want to. We're very risk averse. We don't want to lend, or we don't want to borrow, and so then the Fed makes it easier to lend and borrow. At this point, we're risk averse for something very, very different than we were for the Great Recession. In a macroeconomic context, though, the graph looks the same. A principles macro graph, you have aggregate demand is going to shift in. If this is a supply shock, as a lot of people have been talking about, then we should be seeing this inflation, which we haven't seen. We haven't seen prices going up. I've seen, very few things at the grocery store go up in price. Oatmeal is the notable exception, so I guess I'm wrong on that. We have shortages of toilet paper, which everyone loves to talk about now. And one thing that may actually result in there being toilet paper on the shelves is if they raise the prices. And I'm still wondering why Walmart or United Market haven't done that. And one issue is it's such a competitive market, they can't do it. They just can't raise the prices.
Well, so let me weigh in a little bit on that and then get
Yes,
your
as the
response.
microeconomist, I need some help with that.
Yeah, well, so I've been talking with another one of our colleagues who hopefully I'll one day get onto this podcast, get his own episode here. But um, so he posited, well, why don't we see firms engaged in rationing? So I'm not saying government mandated rationing, but like individual firms engaged in rationing. The next day, he sent me an article about, I think it was Target, Sam's, and Walmart, like rationing. I think it was toilet paper, among other things.
Yeah.
And so then, of course, he's a microeconomist as well. So we spent quite a lot of time theorizing about this, and it's nothing but theory, obviously, at this point. But I think it goes back to this idea of price gouging, which as economists, as a microeconomist anyway, you can just feel free to disagree here. I think there's no such thing as price gouging, because if we charge a price that somebody is willing to pay, that's mutually beneficial exchange. Now, sometimes we don't like it, and sometimes we feel taken advantage of, and sometimes we feel, okay, well, this person is greedy, and there are moral judgments to be had. But as an economist, from just a positive perspective,
From an efficiency argument,
there's no such thing as price gouging. And I argued it may be the case that we need to see increase it in prices. However, as another one of our previous guests, Dr. Pieski, makes the point repeatedly, price innovation is a real type of innovation, and we need to allow that, and we need to see that. A good example of this would be like microtransactions in video games. Several manufacturers, I think EA is probably the main culprit, have tried that repeatedly. Their fan base, at least based on our sort of public reaction, hates that. Now, maybe they don't. Maybe they like to give lip service to hating it, but they actually are fine with it in practice, and that would be a different thing. But let's take them at face value and say they hate that. My expectation is we would see microtransactions go away, right? And so maybe we would rather pay for the whole game up front and pay a little bit higher price, and then not feel like we're getting nickel and dime. People notoriously hate that. But I don't mind, for example, if I pay full freight for a game and I get a good game out of it, and then they offer a DLC and I like the DLC, and then I pay more to get the DLC. I don't mind that. And most people don't, probably. I'd rather pay, $60 and then another $60 to get a big DLC than I would pay $120 up front. And of course, there's an important idea there, which is price discrimination. We're always going to be careful using discrimination in today's climate. So I don't mean that in the political sense. I mean it in
the economic definition of
price discrimination, meaning we can separate different types of consumers out based on their demand, their willingness to pay. And so one of these innovations in response to the toilet paper and baby wipes and some of these cleaning products that I've seen the article come out of, I want to say Denmark, if I remember correctly, where they charge, if you buy one bottle, you pay the normal price, like $5 or something. But if you want a second bottle, you pay like $90.
Yeah.
Okay, now I've translated that to US dollars. It's something else.
I liked that article. That was a good one.
Yeah. And so that, to me, is pricing innovation. And if I had done that, if we do that in a different setting, where people are less upset about the shortage of toilet paper and these other kind of products, they would call that price gouging. But because the sort of public perception is that there are these greedy people out there hoarding, they view that pricing innovation as a positive thing. But I think that's important, why we allow companies to sort of find their own way. Now, let me return really quickly to the rationing argument that our mutual colleague was making, which is, why don't they just raise prices? Well, in part because even if you and I say, well, there's no such thing as price gouging, most people think there is. And I think there's a large negative stigma associated with companies engaged in price gouging. And what's important here is companies like Walmart, Target, Sam's, etc., they're built on having a reputation. And that reputation is important to protect. This is that brand awareness idea. And this is a pretty common idea in economics. Part of why, I forget exactly where I got this example, so I apologize for just stealing it whole hand. Samsung could tomorrow make a whole bunch of defective TVs, save a bunch of money, and cash in, basically. They wouldn't do that because next quarter, their business would go to zero as people begin to realize, okay, Samsung TVs, which have a good reputation for quality now, are actually terrible. So that brand, the importance of their brand, protects us as consumers because they want to keep up that brand. So yes, in theory, they could cash out at any time and we would all be fools and there's nothing we could do about it. But they don't want that. They have a sufficiently long time horizon, but they don't do that. And I think it's the same thing with Walmart. Walmart doesn't want to engage in price gouging, which would fix the shortage, because that would do damage to their eventual reputation.
No.
And this is actually very similar to what you said. You said there's sufficient competition to keep them from raising prices. And that's true. But I think there's sufficient competition on the front of their brand recognition and the fact that they want to develop loyal customers and they don't want people to be furious. So contrary to, I think, what maybe some people would say, well, Walmart is so ubiquitous and they have so much market power, so they can do whatever it is that they like. Well, Walmart would be price gouging, which they're literally predicated on low prices. So I don't see much case for that
Right.
in general. But they haven't done it in this case either. In fact, they would rather turn to rationing, which I think is an important point to make. Rationing is a very blunt thing to do. Rationing says there can be no reason for you to buy more than one or two rolls of toilet paper at a time. Well, what if you have a large family? What if you're a small business who doesn't buy from the big suppliers, and therefore there might be reasons, right? What if I am a director at a nursing home and I go to buy enough for an entire nursing home because I don't want to send a bunch of 50-year-old people out into public to buy their own toilet paper, right? Okay, I'm contriving example, but the point is rationing doesn't account for that, whereas price would. And I think pricing innovation can be very important, right? Another thing that firms could do is say, well, we'll go case by case basis here, and you can buy more if you're with some kind of institution that would prove the need for that.
So these firms are all making these individual decisions and keeping their prices down, which is going to be, and again, this goes back to that demand side. This is demand side shock going on. But then this is also potentially some bad news for the Fed. Because what the Fed is going to do, and so I'm going from your micro back into the macro here. I'm going to take advantage of what you've explained there in micro and bring it back into macroeconomics. Walmart is making these decisions. United is making these decisions. Consumers are making these decisions. And prices are not moving. What the Fed would want to see right now is inflation. Price gouging would contribute to that inflation, but it's not there. It's not happening. So in the aggregate, what we're seeing here is prices are still staying low. I mean, I can complain about oatmeal all I want because I eat oatmeal in the morning. I really enjoy it, and dadgummit, I'm ticked off that it's $3 now instead of $1.50. Darn. Which, man, that was a big price jump for United. Anyway, I need to double check my numbers on it. So
why does price jump for oatmeal and not for toilet paper? That's a puzzle, right?
Oh, well, they didn't have oatmeal in the aisles about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, and I think they went ahead and took the risk and raised the price on that one. But they haven't done it for other things. I haven't seen it for meat. I haven't seen it for vegetables.
Yeah.
So
that's quite the puzzle, and it'd be very interesting to see if we had an answer to that. I don't want to derail you about a point that you're about to make, but I do want to make an aside because this is one of my very favorite things to teach that I actually think few economists teach, and this is why, right? So we always teach when there's something that people want, there must be a way to distribute it. And we think for an important reason that prices are the best way to do that, because prices convey information about the scarcity of the resources used to produce the good and the difficulty of producing it, and simultaneously the value that consumers have for the product. And then we use that price as a member of an array of prices, and that is what allows us to assess whether this is something that we should buy. It conveys information. Prices do. Rationing doesn't do that in the same way. It does it in a much, much more blunt way.
No.
But whether we like it or not, if you charge too low of a price and things sell out, it's not that price is zero. Actually, when things are sold out, what that means is no matter how much I would be willing to pay, I can't get it, which means the price has gone to infinity.
Mm-hmm.
So I did this for my undergraduate class that I'm teaching that's now moved online. And I set this up as a quiz, and it is a picture of the paper goods aisle in Walmart, completely barren. And I said, what's the price of toilet paper, paper towels, whatever it is here, right? And so the options on the quiz are, I picked some random number, $4.23.
Oh, they're gonna love
Zero,
you.
unknown, or infinity. And the answer is infinity.
Right.
Because it doesn't matter how much money I show up to Walmart with, there's no toilet paper for me to have there.
Yeah.
And so, the price gouging thing is because we have it in our head, well, if we allow the toilet paper to sell out at $4.23, then the price of toilet paper is $4.23. It is not. It's actually a higher price because no matter how much I want to spend, I can't get toilet paper right now.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if Walmart had raised it to whatever, instead of $4.23, they'd have raised it to $8.46. They'd have just doubled it. There'd still be toilet paper there. And I would be like, oh man, I'm paying double. You're complaining about paying extra for your oatmeal. And yet you can have oatmeal because you pay for it. Whereas if they'd have kept it low and it sold out, Ryan Mattson gets no oatmeal this morning because it sold out, no matter how much money he's willing to pay for it. So I'll make that as a quick aside, because that's one of my favorite
build off that aside, because this I think is going to lead into. I know we have this outline here, so I'm shooting for getting back on track to the outline. But I like this
Ryan,
aside.
Let me derail you a little because we've essentially recorded an entire podcast now.
Yeah.
Based about nothing but the macroeconomics of coronavirus. So actually what I'd like to do is bring this one in for a landing and then bring you back for a second episode. We'll do a special 2-part episode today.
So
and we'll get to the specifics because I have some really specific questions I want to ask you. But I think maybe putting these two things together doesn't make as much sense. So I'd like you to comment on the price gouging stuff, and then we'll bring this episode in for a land following that, and then I'll bring you back here momentarily for another episode.
So as part of the cliffhanger, I guess, I want to ask you a question then. So you go into the Walmart aisle and you see, you go into, say, the beer section, and you see on shelf after shelf nothing but Corona beer.
Yeah.
Everything else is emptied out, but all you have is Corona, which I don't mind. I personally like it. I think it's very good. But now you have the stigma attached to it based on branding, because very few people want to buy something called Corona right now. Now, what if Walmart then says to you, instead of the price is $0, I'm going to make the price. Let's say I will pay you $2 to take a $2 each for a 6-pack of Corona. Walmart will pay you to take this beer.
So that is like I would pay the price and they would take $2 off, or you're saying literally?
I'm saying they will hand you $2 for every 6-pack of Corona.
So negative interest rates is what you're saying.
So see, spoilers. Now you're getting into spoilers here.
Yeah,
we're actually going to end up seeing certain markets like that in the opposite of the price gouging effect. Kind of this idea of I subsidizing.
We're here in Texas, and I suspect there's a lot of Texas boys that would love to be paid to drink beer.
Yeah.
So that's an excellent cliffhanger.
But will they drink Corona beer?
I'll give you my personal answer here because the listeners at home may not know this about me. I actually have a significant amount of Korean. I shouldn't say heritage because I was raised in America, but Korean ancestors. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they've so graciously given me is that I lack the chromosome to break down alcohol very well. So I don't drink. It's not immoral. I don't judge you for drinking at all. It's just that I react poorly. Sure. So you'd have to pay me a lot to drink, probably more than $2 a beer, because I don't enjoy drinking because it just makes me feel sick. So maybe I should turn the question around. To bring this episode in for a landing, Ryan, what would you do if you were offered $2 per beer?
Well, now we have two different. We have heterogeneous preferences here, and I would probably empty out the aisle.
My guest
So,
today has been Ryan Mattson. Ryan, thank you for joining us on the Econ Buff.
thank you very much, Lee.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Econ Buff. You can find all previous episodes on YouTube at Econ Buff Podcast. You can check out our website at econbuffpodcast.wixsite.com. That's WIXSIT.com. You can contact us at econbuffpodcast@yahoo.com.